Move, I didn't pay for this. Those 6 words, spoken by a man in a designer suit to a 14-year-old girl who was already in pain, already trembling, already doing everything in her power just to hold herself together. Those 6 words were the ones that changed everything. But to understand what happened on that flight, you have to go back to before any of it began. Back to the jet bridge. Back to the moment Naomi Carter stepped onto the plane, and the world had not yet decided what it was going to do to her that day. She walked carefully. Not slowly, not weakly. Carefully, the way someone walks when they have learned over many months that their body requires a different kind of attention than most 14-year-olds ever have to give it. She was thin in the way that illness makes a person thin, not dramatically, not visibly to someone who didn't know what to look for. But there was a gray undertone beneath the warmth of her brown skin that told its own quiet story, if you were the kind of person who knew how to listen to a face. Her hands, which she kept folded in front of her around the strap of her backpack, were the hands of someone conserving energy, gripping something steady, because the world had become a place where steady things mattered more than they used to. Her mother, Diane, walked 1 half step behind her, not hovering, not gripping, just present close enough to catch her if she needed catching far enough back to let her daughter move through the world on her own terms. Diane was tall, graceful in the particular way that people who have carried enormous weight for a very long time tend to become graceful. The unnecessary things stripped away, what remained being purely functional and quietly devastating in its precision. Her eyes moved over everything, the other passengers filing through the jet bridge, the flight attendants visible at the cabin door ahead the long aisle stretching beyond them with a watchfulness that never quite turned off, that had probably not turned off in months. Diane carried a structured leather tote on her shoulder, professional dark brown, worn at one corner, in a way that suggested it had been to a great many places and intended to go to a great many more. At security, when she had opened it for the agent, something had been briefly visible inside a thick manila folder, the kind that holds documents of consequence with a federal agency seal printed in the upper left corner, partially visible before she zipped the bag closed again. The agent had not noticed. The other passengers in line had not noticed. The moment had passed unremarkable, the way moments carrying enormous weight sometimes pass through ordinary spaces without anyone knowing what they're carrying. First class. Naomi murmured, not quite a question, not quite a statement. Something between them said quietly as they stepped through the cabin door and the forward seats came into view, wide and pale and arranged with the deliberate calm of spaces designed for people who have decided they deserve calm. First class, Diane confirmed, and there was something in her voice when she said it. Something careful and proud at exactly the same time, braided together in a way that could not be separated, because the pride was inseparable from what the two of them had been through together. From the months of appointments and waiting rooms and words that no child should have to learn the meaning of at 14, and Diane had decided when she booked these tickets that her daughter was not going to make a 5-hour cross-country flight in a middle seat in economy while her body was doing what it was doing. That had not been a negotiation. It had simply been a decision made quietly in the way Diane made most of her important decisions. At the gate counter, before they had boarded, something small had happened that Naomi had not noticed because she had been looking at her phone. The gate agent, a young woman early 20s, efficient and professional, had glanced at Diane's boarding pass, then looked up at Diane's face, and something had shifted in her expression very briefly, the flicker of a recognition that was quickly suppressed. And Diane, without breaking her stride, without changing her expression, had given the smallest possible shake of her head, almost imperceptible, a millimeter of motion that said very clearly to someone who was paying attention, "Not now." And the gate agent had nodded once and looked back at her screen, and that was that. Naomi had not seen any of it. She would not understand what it meant until much later. They found their row without difficulty. Naomi took the window 3A, and Diane settled into the middle seat beside her 3B, with the aisle seat 3C still empty. The forward cabin was filling around them with the particular unhurried efficiency of first-class boarding people who traveled often enough that the ritual had become automatic. Bags stowed, jackets hung, drinks ordered before the door had even closed. Naomi leaned her head back almost immediately, the way she did in waiting rooms, in examination chairs, in the back seats of cars after long appointments when the effort of being present in a medical space had used up most of what she had for the day. It was not dramatic, this leaning back. It was practiced and quiet, and it was the first thing she always did when she arrived somewhere that allowed her to stop performing wellness for a little while. Diane, without being asked, reached up to the overhead bin and drew out the thin airline blanket and draped it carefully across her daughter's lap. The gesture was completely automatic, executed without thought or announcement, the way you do a thing you have done 1,000 times and expect to do 1,000 more. She smoothed the edge of the blanket along Naomi's thigh, and then sat back and folded her hands in her lap and breathed, which was its own kind of labor after the airport, after security, after the gate, after all the small negotiations that travel required. Naomi watched the tarmac through the window, the ground crew moving with their practiced urgency below the wing luggage carts, threading between the aircraft, the ordinary mechanical world doing its ordinary mechanical work. And her face was tired, but present. The face of someone who had not given up paying attention to the world, just learned to pay attention to it more selectively. Diane opened her tote to retrieve her phone, and the manila folder shifted inside the bag, and the federal seal was briefly visible again. The words Carter Commission on Civil Rights in Transportation printed in clean government font above a Washington, D.C. address, before she zipped the bag closed, and the moment passed. In seat 5, a woman named Gloria had already settled in with a paperback novel and reading glasses on a beaded chain around her neck. She was in her early 70s, silver-haired, with the kind of unhurried present quality that comes from having paid attention to the world for a very long time and having decided that most of what other people call urgency is invented. She glanced at Naomi when the girl leaned back, not obviously, not intrusively, with the particular attention of someone who has spent a long professional lifetime reading the faces of young people and knowing almost immediately when one of them is carrying something that is too heavy for them. In seat 4, a broad-shouldered man named Darnell had settled in with the ease of someone who was not accustomed to first class, but was not going to be awkward about it either. He had upgraded that morning on an impulse, standing at the gate with his coffee, looking at the upgrade option on his phone, and deciding that today he was going to. He was 46 years old and ran a construction company in Queens, and he had the particular stillness of a man who had learned very early that the most useful thing you can do in most situations is keep your mouth shut and your eyes open until you understand what you are actually looking at. He noticed Naomi, the way she leaned back, the way Diane covered her without being asked, and he said nothing and opened his magazine and began to read. Derek Calloway boarded 12 minutes after they did, which meant he was among the last of the first-class passengers to arrive, and he came down the aisle with the particular quality of motion that certain men have perfected over a lifetime of moving through spaces that have always accommodated them. Unhurried, unquestioning. The absolute certainty of a man who has never had to wonder whether the space he was about to occupy had been waiting for him, because in his experience, spaces always had been. He was in his mid-40s, broad-shouldered, in a way that filled an expensive suit, effectively with platinum blonde hair going gray at the temples, in the way that glossy magazines describe as distinguished and that functions in the right rooms as its own kind of credential. His shoes were polished. His carry-on was designer. His expression as he moved down the aisle, checking row numbers, was the particular blankness of a man whose disdain had been operating at such a constant frequency for so long that it had simply settled into the resting state of his face, a default setting he was probably not even conscious of wearing. He reached row 3 and stopped. He looked at the row number on the overhead panel. He looked at his boarding pass. He looked at Naomi, who had her eyes half closed and her head resting against the window frame. He looked at Diane. He looked back at the boarding pass. Something moved behind his eyes, not quite a word, not quite a decision, something more like a calibration, quick and automatic. The kind of assessment that happens faster than conscious thought, and whose conclusions are delivered before the reasoning has even been examined. He stowed his bag in the overhead compartment without a word, with the practiced efficiency of a man who had done this hundreds of times, and he sat down in 3C, and for a while, maybe 10 minutes, maybe 12, nothing happened. The final passengers boarded. The flight attendants moved through their pre-departure routines. The cabin settled into the soft pre-flight murmur of a space preparing to leave the ground, and there was nothing to indicate that anything unusual was about to happen. Then Naomi shifted in her seat. It was a small movement. She adjusted her position, pulling the blanket slightly higher with one hand, tilting her body a few degrees toward the window, as a faint wave of nausea moved through her the way it sometimes did, unpredictably, regardless of what she did or did not do to prevent it. Her breathing changed just slightly, not dramatically, just enough that someone sitting directly beside her would notice the change in the rhythm of it. Derek noticed. He turned his head and looked at her the way you look at something that has appeared in a space you consider yours and that you have not given permission to be there. He did not address Naomi. He looked across her lap at Diane, and he said, "She's sick." He said it the way you state a problem that someone else is responsible for solving. Diane looked at him. Her expression did not change by a single degree. "She's fine," she said. "She's resting. She doesn't look fine." There was an edge to it, not quite open hostility, but something warming in that direction, something that had not yet reached full temperature. "Is she contagious?" "Because if she's contagious, she is not contagious," Diane said, and the steadiness in her voice was a remarkable thing. The steadiness of a woman who had answered variations of this question in enough different rooms that she had long since stopped flinching at it. "My daughter has a medical condition. She is not a danger to anyone on this flight." Derek made a sound. It was not quite a word. It was the kind of sound that communicates contempt while maintaining the technical deniability of having said nothing, the sound of a man who has learned to weaponize ambiguity. He leaned back, adjusted his collar, the performance of a man resettling into his own comfort with great deliberateness. "Well," he said, "I paid a significant amount of money for this seat. I didn't pay for this." Diane looked at him for a long moment, one full, steady, unblinking moment, and then she said, "Neither did she." And she turned back to her daughter and did not look at him again. The plane pushed back from the gate. The safety demonstration played. The engines built to their departure roar, and then the ground dropped away and they were airborne, climbing over the city, and below them the towers and bridges of New York shrank into something small and manageable, and above them there was nothing but sky, and in seat 3. C. Derek Calloway had not relaxed. Dr. Elliot Wade had been reading a medical journal since before the door closed. His attention given entirely to an article about post-surgical inflammation protocols that he had been meaning to read for 3 weeks, and had only now, in the enforced stillness of a departing aircraft, found the time for. He was in his early 50s. Lean, with the kind of unhurried observational quality that long years of clinical work had built into him, at a level below conscious choice, he simply noticed things automatically, the way a musician hears intervals in ambient noise. He had noticed the girl in 3B before he had opened his journal. His hospital ID badge was clipped to the lapel of his jacket, facing inward against the fabric, not concealed, exactly just oriented the way it was when he was moving between the hospital and the outside world, and had not thought to remove it. It was visible if you were close and looking at the right angle, but no one in the cabin was close enough or looking at the right angle, and so it sat there against his lapel, carrying information that nobody had yet thought to seek. He had not intervened in the exchange between Derek and Diane. He had lowered his journal by perhaps 2 inches and watched it over the top of the pages with the clinical detachment that was not actually detachment at all, but a very trained way of caring from a careful distance. And he had decided in the way doctors decide things quickly, and based on probabilities that it was going to resolve itself, that the man would find some other way to occupy his resentment, that the flight attendant would manage it, that it would pass. It was not going to pass. Carmen, the lead flight attendant, early 30s, efficient in the way of someone who has managed 1,000 difficult situations with a professional surface that shows nothing of the work happening underneath it, appeared at row 3 approximately 20 minutes into the flight, summoned by Derek's raised hand, and the particular expression of a man who has decided that a problem he is having is someone else's responsibility to fix. Elliot listened to the exchange over the top of his journal with his eyes on the page and his full attention on the row across the aisle. Derek kept his voice low-angled away from Diane with the precision of a man who knows the performance he is putting on and knows its audience. But the first-class cabin was not large, and the angling was insufficient. He wanted Carmen to move the girl. She was obviously unwell. He preferred not to spend a 5-hour flight sitting adjacent to someone who was sick. It was, he said, a reasonable request. Carmen held the pause for exactly 1 beat, the beat of a professional deciding which version of professional she was going to be in this particular moment, and then she said she would check on availability. She returned 5 minutes later. First class was fully booked. No available seats. Then move someone else, Derek said. Problem solving. That's what customer service means. Carmen held the line passengers already seated, could not be asked to relocate. Without cause, she said, and she wanted to assure him that they would do everything possible to make his flight comfortable, and her professionalism was a remarkable thing to witness, absolutely uncrackable on the surface, while behind her eyes you could see the careful and continuous work of a woman choosing, moment by moment, how much of what she actually thought to let into her expression. Naomi had heard all of it. She had her eyes closed, but she was not asleep, and she opened her eyes and looked at her mother, and Diane looked back at her, and something passed between them in that look, the particular communication of 2 people who have been in enough difficult rooms together that they have developed a language for it that requires no words, the language of shared understanding and shared exhaustion, and the decision made together silently to keep going. "Close your eyes," Diane said quietly. Naomi did, but her face, even in the manufactured stillness of closed eyes, carried the specific tiredness of someone who has stopped being surprised by the particular form this kind of thing takes, and has started instead simply being tired of it. 40 minutes into the flight, the flat center of America was spreading out 37,000 feet below them, enormous and indifferent, and the first-class cabin had settled into the particular suspended quiet of a long flight at cruising altitude. The kind of quiet that is not actually quiet, but is the accumulation of small sounds. The hum of the engines, the low murmur of conversations, the soft percussion of ice and glasses layered into something that functions as quiet because none of it demands attention. Derek had his phone out. He was doing what people do with phones when they are pretending not to be bothered by something that is in fact bothering them very much. The continuous, purposeless scrolling that is not reading, not engaging, not actually interacting with anything on the screen. Just the performance of distraction, the body trying to signal to the room that everything is fine, while everything is clearly not fine. He shifted in his seat. He glanced sideways at Naomi. He shifted again. Elliot across the aisle in 3D had put the medical journal face down on his tray table. His hands were still. His face was still, but his attention had fully relocated from the article about post-surgical inflammation to the row across the aisle, and it had been there for the better part of 30 minutes. Naomi woke from the shallow, restless half-sleep she had been managing with more urgency than before, her eyes opening not gradually, but all at once, the way they opened when something inside her had changed while she was not paying attention. A small, involuntary sound came out of her, the kind of sound you make when pain catches you off guard, before you have had time to prepare for it, and her hand went to her abdomen, pressing there with the practiced motion of someone who has done this before, who has learned exactly where to press and how hard, and her face, which had already been pale, went a degree paler. Derek looked at her. His face moved through something that had nothing to do with concern. It was the heightened irritation of a man whose experience of a thing he paid for is being disrupted in a way he has decided is unacceptable, the irritation of someone who has concluded that the disruption is a personal affront rather than a medical event. He looked at Naomi the way you look at something malfunctioning in a space where malfunctions are not supposed to occur. "Hey," he said. She did not respond. She was focused entirely inward on the pain, on the work of keeping herself together, the particular internal labor that had become her primary occupation over the past months. "Hey," he said again, louder, the volume carrying the quality of a man who has decided that the reason he was not heard the first time was insufficiency of volume rather than irrelevance of address. "Are you going to be sick? Because if you are, you need to go to the bathroom." "She's not going anywhere," Diane said, turning toward him fully now, her whole body rotating in the seat to face him, and her voice was still controlled, but something had entered it. Not anger exactly, because what was in Diane Carter's voice in that moment was something older and more absolute than anger, something that had been building for months in waiting rooms and examination chairs and corridors where no one looked at her daughter the right way. Something that had been waiting for exactly this to become fully itself. "Leave her alone. She is a child in pain. She's making people uncomfortable," Derek said. "She is a child in pain," Diane said again. Each word given equal weight, equal deliberateness, the way you speak when you need to be very sure you are being understood, and you need to stop talking. "Don't tell me what to, sir." Carmen had appeared at the end of the row, as if materialized by the tension itself, her expression having crossed a threshold somewhere between the last time she spoke to Derek, and now she had moved from professional neutrality into something more direct, something that was not hostility, but was in the same general neighborhood of it, the neighborhood of a person who has decided that a line has been crossed and is not going to pretend otherwise. "I need to ask you to lower your voice." The silence that followed lasted 4 minutes, and then Naomi made a sound that was not small. It was a short, sharp gasp, the sound of a body doing something unexpected, catching its owner off guard. And then Naomi was leaning forward with both hands pressed hard against her midsection, and her face had gone from pale to something closer to gray, and Diane was already half out of her seat, calling for the flight attendant, and across the aisle Elliot was already moving, already on his feet, already past the armrest, before the gasp had fully faded from the air. "I'm a doctor," he said, and there was no drama in it, no performance. He said it the way you state a relevant fact, and he crouched down beside Naomi's seat so that he was at her eye level rather than looming above her, and his hospital badge swung forward as he crouched and hung there, visible. Dr. Elliot Wade, M.D., attending physician, NYU Langone Medical Center. And Diane read it in one quick sweep of her eyes and held it there for one beat longer than was casual before she turned back to her daughter. "Hey, Elliot," said to Naomi, his voice pitched exactly for her and no one else. "I'm Dr. Wade. Can you hear me? Can you tell me where the pain is?" Naomi's eyes were open but glassy, the eyes of someone working very hard to stay present in a body that was making that difficult. Everywhere she whispered. "Okay. Scale of 1 to 10. Where is it right now?" The sound she made in response was somewhere between a word and something more animal than a word. Elliot nodded. "Okay. That's okay. I've got you. Stay with me." He looked up at Carmen, who was already there, already leaning in with the focused attention of someone who has shifted from flight attendant to first responder in the span of 10 seconds. "I need to know what's in your medical kit," he said. I need her baseline any history you have, and I need you to notify the captain that we may have a developing medical situation." Carmen was already reaching for her radio. Diane was talking rapidly, but with the practiced precision of a mother who has given this particular set of information in emergency situations enough times that she has stopped having to search for the words. Naomi's condition, the episodes, their frequency, their increasing severity over the past 6 weeks, the appointment waiting for them in Los Angeles, the specialist they had been trying to reach for 4 months, the fact that the underlying diagnosis was still incomplete because the imaging they needed was still pending. Elliot listened with complete attention, asking precise, clarifying questions, building his picture quickly and thoroughly, the way a doctor does when time is a factor and guessing is not an option. The captain's voice came over the PA system calm, measured with the particular flatness that pilot voices carry in all circumstances, which has the strange effect of making serious announcements feel more serious rather than less, informing passengers that the crew was attending to a medical situation in the cabin and asking everyone to remain seated with their seatbelts fastened. And then Derek said it. He had been sitting in 3C, watching all of this unfold, and he had not moved, had not offered anything, had maintained the stiff, contained quality of a man performing the appearance of patience he did not feel. And then he opened his mouth and said, "Can we speed this up? Some of us are trying to have a comfortable flight." The words fell into the cabin like something dropped from a very great height. The man in 4A who had been doing something on his laptop stopped doing it. The woman in 2C who had been asleep opened her eyes. Carmen stopped moving and looked at him with an expression that she did not bother to make professional, because there are things that happen in a confined space at altitude that temporarily suspend the professional performance, and this was one of them. Diane turned. She turned slowly with the deliberateness of a woman who has decided exactly what she is going to do and is doing it with her full attention, and she looked at Derek Calloway with an expression that was very quiet and very still, and absolutely devastating, the expression of a woman who has spent her life being required to hold herself together in the presence of people like this man, and who has never, not once, let them see her break. "That is my daughter," she said. She did not say anything else. She did not need to. 4 words delivered in that voice, carrying everything that words could carry, and several things they could not. And then she turned back to Naomi, and she did not look at Derek again. Elliot crouched beside. Naomi had not turned around, but the set of his shoulders changed, barely perceptible, a tightening, the physical equivalent of a jaw clenching. He reached out and took Naomi's wrist, gently 2 fingers against her pulse. "What's your name?" he said to the girl, his voice still pitched only for her. "Naomi. Naomi. You're doing great. Stay with me. Can you take a breath for me, slow and deep?" She tried. It came out ragged. "That's okay. Try again. There you go. There you go." The atmosphere in first class had become something different from what it had been 40 minutes ago. The casual, comfortable ease of the forward cabin, the drinks and the wide seats, and the particular low-grade arrogance of a space designed for people who have decided they deserve the best the aircraft has to offer, had been replaced by something alert and uncomfortable and entirely real, the way a room changes when something true enters it and refuses to leave. Gloria in 5A had put her book face down on her tray table. She was watching, obviously not with the head-turning attention of someone making a performance of their observation, but with the peripheral, continuous watchfulness of a woman who had spent 31 years as a high school teacher, reading rooms and students, and the invisible currents of feeling that run between people, and who had never, in all those years, lost the ability to identify when something was genuinely wrong. She was watching Naomi, and she was watching Derek, and she was watching Diane, and what she was feeling in her chest was something she had felt before many times in many different configurations, and it had not gotten easier with repetition. Darnell in 4A had closed his magazine. He sat with the particular controlled stillness of a man who has something to say and is deciding carefully whether this is the moment to say it. His face was a locked door with a great deal of noise behind it. Elliot was monitoring Naomi with the steady, focused attention of someone who has made peace with the limits of what he can do and is doing everything within those limits with absolute precision. Her blood pressure was low, not dangerously, but significantly in that uncomfortable middle territory where you cannot afford to relax, but you cannot yet act with the full urgency of a true emergency. So you hold. You wait. You watch. Her breathing was beginning to stabilize slowly and incompletely, but moving in the right direction. Derek shifted in his seat, the loud, deliberate shift of a man who needs the people around him to register his suffering, and then flagged Carmen again. "They're talking about diverting the flight," he said, not quite a question, not quite a statement. "The captain is assessing options," Carmen said. "Because of her." Carmen looked at him for a moment before she answered. "Because of the medical situation? Yes. This is..." He stopped himself, started again. His voice had dropped, gone low and hard, the voice of a man who has decided to show how serious he is by removing the pretense of civility from his tone. He said that diverting the flight would cost the airline money and inconvenience every other passenger on board, and that before anyone started throwing the entire flight plan out the window, someone ought to seriously consider whether the appropriate thing was not in fact to move this passenger to the rear of the aircraft, where she would be more comfortable, where there was more room, where her medical situation could be managed without disrupting the passengers who had paid for the forward cabin. Elliot spoke without turning around. He aimed his voice with absolute precision, and there was nothing raised about it, nothing theatrical, but it cut through the cabin the way a certain kind of authority cuts through noise, not because it is loud, but because it is completely certain of itself. He listed Naomi's vitals in plain language. He described what low blood pressure at altitude meant for a body that was already working too hard. He explained what the movement of a patient in her condition from the front of the aircraft to the rear would do to those vitals and what would likely happen after that. He said, moving her to the back of this plane is not a therapeutic option. It is the opposite of a therapeutic option. And if something happens to her because we moved her because someone found her presence inconvenient, and he let the sentence stop where it stopped, which was enough, which was more than enough because everyone in that cabin could finish it. Derek's jaw tightened. "I'm not a doctor," he said. "No," Elliot agreed. "You're not." 3 passengers in the rows behind them had heard the exchange clearly and completely. Gloria pressed her lips together and looked at the back of Derek's head with the expression of a woman who has spent 31 years finding diplomatic ways to address a particular kind of person and who is no longer feeling particularly diplomatic. She said nothing, but she took her reading glasses off her nose and let them hang on the beaded chain, the gesture of a woman setting something down because she is preparing to fully engage with what is in front of her. Darnell leaned forward just slightly, just enough, and looked across the aisle at Derek. He did not say anything. He just looked with the calm, patient attention of a man who has learned that looking can be its own kind of statement. He held it for exactly 3 seconds. Then he leaned back and returned to whatever he had been doing. But the message had been delivered and received and logged. The turbulence came without warning, the way the worst turbulence always does. A sudden rolling pocket of disturbed air sharp enough to rattle the overhead bins and tip drinks sideways and make the whole aircraft shudder with the reminder that it was a machine in the air and physics applied to it as to everything else. It lasted 4 seconds, maybe 5, the kind of turbulence that is technically minor but feels significant because your body registers it as an interruption of something you had decided to trust. In those 4 seconds, Derek's elbow came off the armrest and his body shifted in the seat and his foot. His right foot polished shoe, expensive sole swung forward and connected with Naomi's leg with a force that was not accidental, in the way that accidents are weightless, and this was not weightless, and Naomi cried out a sound so sharp and so involuntary that it cut through the entire first-class cabin, like something physical, like a thing that entered the air and changed the composition of it. The cabin froze. Derek did not flinch. He did not turn toward her. He did not reach out or recoil or give any of the automatic responses that a person gives when they understand that they have hurt someone. He straightened in his seat and he tugged his jacket back into place along his shoulders with one sharp, precise motion. And he said, "Move." "I didn't pay for this." 6 words, delivered into the silence that followed Naomi's cry. Into a first-class cabin where 15 people had just heard a 14-year-old girl in pain make a sound that none of them would forget, and the man beside her had responded by adjusting his jacket and invoking his ticket price. What followed was a specific kind of silence, a silence that had shape and weight and direction that was not the absence of sound, but the presence of something that had not yet found its form. Every phone in the cabin was being reached for, or had already been reached for, held up at the careful angles of people who understand that they are witnessing something that needs to be witnessed and preserved. Naomi's hand went to her leg. She pressed there, and the tears that came were silent, not the performed tears of a child seeking attention, but the involuntary tears of a body that has been hurt and cannot help but report it. She turned her face toward the window, and then, with a steadiness that was more heartbreaking than any amount of crying would have been, she turned back to her mother and said, "I'm okay." The reflex. Always the reflex. The thing Diane had given her. "Hold your chin up, baby," expressed in these 2 inadequate words that she reached for automatically because they were what she had, because they were what she had always had. And she said them to her mother in the voice of someone who has said them so many times that they no longer needed to be true to be said. Diane's face did something that had no name in any language Diane had ever learned. She turned to face Derek, and what she gave him was not anger. She had moved through anger and come out the other side of it into something quieter and more absolute. Something that had been built over months of watching her daughter navigate a world that kept finding new ways to make itself harder than it needed to be. And what she gave him was that all of it in one look, held for one sustained and unblinking moment. Elliot was already moving. He was at Naomi's side before Derek had finished adjusting his jacket, checking her leg, checking her abdomen, checking her pulse with his fingers against her wrist, and his eyes on her face, reading what was there with the focused attention of a doctor who has learned to read faces the way other people read text quickly and completely. His voice when he spoke to Naomi was pitched only for her. "Stay with me." "I've got you. Tell me where it is now." Carmen had her radio in her hand before Elliot reached the row. She was speaking into it with the clipped, precise language of someone who has crossed from managing a difficult passenger into documenting an incident. And there was a difference in her voice now, something that had hardened, something that had decided. From 5A. Gloria reached forward and placed her hand on Diane's shoulder. Diane turned. Gloria looked at her, just looked and gave one slow, deliberate nod. The kind that needs no words, because it is itself a complete sentence. "I see you. I see her. I see all of it." And Diane held that look for a moment and nodded back. The captain's voice came over the PA system. He said they would be making an unscheduled landing in Denver. Medical personnel had been notified. Ground crews would be ready upon arrival. Derek understood what that meant. He sat very still, and his face moved through a sequence of things. Surprise, calculation, something that might have been the very earliest stage of guilt if guilt had been a place he visited often enough to recognize the entrance. He had kicked a sick child. He was going to Denver. and somewhere in the forward cabin, a leather tote with a federal agency seal was sitting under seat 3B, and he did not yet know what was inside it. Carmen relayed the ground medical team's recommendation to Elliot in a low, quick voice that carried the compressed urgency of two people who both understand the stakes and neither of whom needs it explained divert to Denver 44 minutes from their current position or continue to Los Angeles 4 hours and 8 minutes remaining. The captain wanted Elliot's read. The decision would be made in the next 90 seconds. Elliot looked at the numbers on the portable blood pressure monitor Carmen had retrieved from the forward medical kit. He looked at Naomi's face. He looked at the monitor again, running the calculation with the focused speed of someone who has made harder calls than this in louder rooms, mapping what he knew against what he didn't know, and arriving as he always arrived at the most defensible position given the available information. He was about to speak when Naomi said, without opening her eyes fully, without changing her position against the seat, Denver is 44 minutes. L.A. is 4 more hours. That's just math. Tell them Denver. She had heard every word. She was 14, not 4. Diane's face did something complicated, the face of a mother whose instinct is to protect and whose daughter has just demonstrated not for the first time that she does not need protecting from the truth. She looked at Elliot. Elliot looked at Carmen. Denver, he said. Carmen raised the radio. The captain's announcement came 2 minutes later, unscheduled landing. Denver, 45 minutes. Medical personnel notified ground crews ready. And the word inconvenience appeared in the announcement. The way it always did in these situations, inserted by protocol. And it landed on Derek Calloway in a specific and particular way that the captain had not intended, but that Derek felt nonetheless the word landing like something aimed directly at him, even though it had not been. Darnell in 4A. Said Denver out loud, without preamble, without addressing anyone. Just said the word into the air of the cabin, like a man calculating a cost and deciding with full clarity whether he was okay with paying it. His voice carried no complaint, no resentment, nothing that was about him at all. It was simply the word spoken into the air acknowledged. Denver. Gloria echoed from 5A dryer with a weight behind it that was not quite irony but was in its neighborhood. The atmosphere in this cabin had shifted into something that was no longer ambiguous. Whatever benefit of the doubt had been available to Derek Calloway in the first hour of this flight had been quietly and collectively withdrawn, not with raised voices or pointed accusations or any of the dramatic forms that withdrawal can take, but simply withdrawn the way light leaves a room when the sun moves behind clouds gradually and completely and without announcement. He felt it. You could see him feeling it in the very slight change in the set of his shoulders, in the way he stopped shifting in his seat and went very still instead. Carmen moving back toward the galley, past the senior flight attendant Brenda, 62 years old. 30 years working this route, a woman who had seen more in airplane cabins than most people see in lifetimes, and handed her a folded sheet of paper without a word. Brenda unfolded it, read it, and her expression closed like a door. She looked from the paper to Diane, then to Derek, then back to Carmen. Something passed between the two women in that look that was specific and decided, and then Brenda folded the paper again and put it in her jacket pocket, and they both went back to work. Diane had not looked at Derek Calloway in 20 minutes. Not because she was afraid of him, not because the anger had subsided, but because she had made a decision, the quiet internal kind that certain women make without announcement or drama, that he did not deserve her eyes. That her eyes were better spent on the person who deserved them most, which was Naomi, who was lying back against the reclined seat with a thin blanket pulled to her chin and her face turned slightly toward the window, the way she always positioned herself when her body was using everything it had and there was nothing left over for performance. Diane watched her daughter and Naomi as if sensing it even through the thin veil of half-sleep turned slightly toward her mother, and that small motion, a fraction of a degree, an unconscious adjustment toward the warmth she knew was there, was enough. It was everything, in fact. It was the thing that made the rest of it bearable. Gloria reached forward from 5A and placed her hand on Diane's shoulder. Diane turned. Gloria looked at her, just looked with the full, unguarded attention of a woman in her early 70s who has seen a great deal of the world and has learned that sometimes the most useful thing you can offer another person is the simple act of seeing them completely, and she gave one slow, deliberate nod. The kind of nod that is not about words, that says, I see you. I see her. I see all of it. And Diane held that gaze for a long moment and nodded back. Derek saw the exchange. He was watching from his peripheral vision with the particular quality of attention of a man who cannot stop watching something even though watching it is not doing him any good. Something moved across his face when he saw it, something smaller and less constructed than anything he had shown in the previous hour, something that looked for just a moment like a man catching an unexpected reflection of himself and not entirely recognizing what he sees. He looked away quickly. "Are you scared?" Naomi asked. She had opened her eyes and was looking at Elliot with the direct, unqualified attention of a girl who has decided she wants a real answer and is not going to pretend to want anything less. Elliot, who had been watching her numbers and running his continuous internal calculations, met her gaze without hesitation. "I'm focused," he said. "There's a difference." "Is that what you tell your patients?" "It's what I tell myself. Patients don't usually ask." "I'm asking." "I know you are." He leaned forward, slightly, elbows on his knees, addressing her at her level, the way he had been doing since he first crouched beside her seat. "Here's the truth, Naomi. You are not the worst I've seen. Not even close. I've worked trauma. I've sat with people in situations that were genuinely unsurvivable and watched them fight anyway. What you're doing right now that's fighting. Your body is handling this. My job is to get you to people who have the tools I don't have, and we are 23 minutes from that. So no, I'm not scared. I'm counting down." She looked at him for a long time, measuring something. Then she said, "Okay." Just that. And from beside her, Diane exhaled slow, long, barely audible, the sound of a woman releasing a breath she had been holding for longer than she could account for, and Elliot caught her eye over Naomi's head, and something passed between the two adults in that look. The understanding of two people who are both working to remain strong for a child who is watching everything and deserves not to be frightened more than she already is. Derek in 3C had heard all of it. Something in his posture had changed over the past 20 minutes, not transformed, not softened into anything recognizable as remorse, but loosened slightly in the way that a fist clenched too long begins to cramp, and is forced by the simple biology of it to release a fraction. It was not redemption. It was the very beginning of reckoning, and there is a significant difference between those two things. And then Naomi turned her head and looked directly at him. She had not looked at him since the kick had been looking at the window at the ceiling at her mother at Elliot. But now she turned and looked at him the way she had been taught to look at hard things, straight on and without flinching, without the softening that most people apply to difficult realities to make them more livable, without any of that. She just looked at him, 14 years old and sick and tired and more present in the room than anyone else in it, and she said, "Why did you kick me?" The cabin did not go silent, because it was already silent. But the quality of the silence changed. It became something with weight, with direction, with the particular density of air in a room where an important question has just been asked and everyone is waiting to see what the answer will be. "I'm not asking to fight," Naomi said. Her voice was thin, still slightly breathless, but completely clear. "I just want to understand why." Derek's mouth opened. Nothing came out. He sat there with his opened mouth and his polished shoes and his expensive suit and his complete inability to produce a single word that would make what he had done comprehensible, because it was not comprehensible, because there was no version of the explanation that did not expose what it actually was. "I wasn't bothering you," Naomi said. "I was just sitting there." The silence stretched. And then Derek said, very quietly, "I know." 2 words delivered without performance, without qualification, without any of the protective architecture he had been constructing around himself since he sat down. Just 2 words stripped bare, and the stripping of them cost him something visible. Naomi looked at him for another moment, one long, clear, assessing moment, and then she turned back toward the ceiling. She had gotten what she came for. Not an apology, not justice. The truth which is smaller than justice, but is sometimes all that is available. And she had decided she was fine with that. And the deciding of it was its own kind of strength. 18 minutes to Denver. The captain's voice had confirmed the landing prep, and Carmen was moving through the first-class cabin with the efficient choreography of final approach tray tables, stowed seats upright. Cups collected, the physical ritual of descent performed with the same professional smoothness. It always was, even when everything else was completely different from usual. She reached row 3 last. She looked at Diane, at the controlled, exhausted, absolutely unbreakable face of this woman, and she said quietly enough that it was just for the row I need to ask you to bring your seat forward. But I want you to know that Dr. Wade and I are going to stay right here through the landing. We're not going anywhere." Diane nodded and reached back to bring the seat upright without releasing Naomi's hand. The 2 motions performed simultaneously with the ease of someone who has learned to do everything one-handed because the other hand always belongs somewhere specific. Carmen looked at Derek. "Sir, tray table and seat upright, please." He complied without a word. She held the pause for 1 beat, then moved on. "Will there be an ambulance?" Naomi asked, her voice directed at the ceiling. "There will be an ambulance," Elliot said. She was quiet for a moment, processing this. "Mom's going to have to cancel the appointment in L.A., she said then. She called 3 times to get it. She waited 4 months. Diane began. I know. But her voice carried the specific weight of a girl who has spent months being the reason for things getting canceled, rearranged, put on hold, who has accumulated a kind of debt to her mother's life that she cannot repay and cannot stop noticing. "Naomi Marie Carter," Diane said, and there was that register. The full name, the measured weight of each syllable, the absolute end of a debate. You do not apologize for being sick. You do not apologize for needing care. That is not a thing you are allowed to do. Not today, not ever. And she said it with such complete certainty, such total absence of any room for argument, that Naomi's face shifted. Something in it gave way, and she closed her eyes and leaned back and let herself for just a moment stop being the person who was trying to make things easier for everyone. Darnell leaned across the aisle, not toward Derek, toward the space between them, angling his voice to Carrie without making a speech of it. Little girls got more guts than most people I've ever met. Nobody disputed this. Derek did not respond, but something in his shoulders moved a microfracture in his stillness, barely visible but there. The turbulence returned, sharper, this time a sudden drop, the kind that makes your stomach arrive somewhere before the rest of you does, the kind that rattles bins and tilts drinks and makes people grab armrests without deciding to grab them. Naomi's hand closed into a fist on her thigh. "I'm okay," she said automatically, the reflex operating independently of everything else. Elliot was already moving. "Deep breath with me," he said, already beside her, already watching her face. "In through the nose." She did it. Hold 2, 3 now, out through the mouth. They did it 3 times, and by the end, her pulse had come back down to something closer to manageable, and the distinction between manageable and good had become the central axis around which this entire flight had been organized. Gloria in 5A had her eyes closed. Not from fear of turbulence. This woman had flown more times than she could count, and turbulence held no fear for her, but because she was doing something private and internal, focusing everything she had onto a single point, the way you do when prayer and hope are the same gesture. She opened her eyes and looked at Naomi and said quietly, mostly to herself, "That's it, sweetheart. Keep going." Derek heard it. He turned involuntarily toward 5. The reflex of a man who was not expecting softness in the air around him, and registered it as a sound his body turned toward before his mind could assess it. Gloria was not looking at him. She was looking at Naomi with the unguarded, complete, utterly unconditional love that older women sometimes direct at children who are not theirs. The kind of love that has been built up over a lifetime of caring about people, and has become too large to be contained to just the family they were given. It spills over inevitably to whoever needs it most in the room. Derek looked at that expression and then looked away. His jaw worked. The landing gear deployed with the solid mechanical thunk of the aircraft committing itself to the ground, the sound of a decision being made, and Elliot said, "Naomi, when we land there's going to be some movement. Paramedics, a stretcher, some equipment. It's going to feel fast and busy. Your only job is to breathe. Will you be there when they come on right there?" "Okay," she said. She closed her eyes, and then she opened them again, turned her head and looked directly at Derek Calloway. The second time she had looked at him since the kick. But this time, with the full weight of everything that had happened between then and now, pressing into the look, and the cabin was already silent. And in that silence, Naomi's look at Derek was the loudest thing in the room. He held her gaze. He had nowhere else to put his eyes. The wheels hit the runway with the full-body jolt of an aircraft giving itself back to gravity, and the engines reversed with a roar that pressed everyone into their seats. And Denver International came up fast outside the windows, the tarmac, the terminal lights, the emergency vehicles already visible and moving into position along the taxiway, red and blue lights turning in the thin Colorado air. Naomi felt the landing in her abdomen like a second blow. She pressed her lips together and held on. She had used up her sounds. She simply gripped the armrest and breathed, and let the plane decelerate around her, while Elliot, who had not sat back down since the landing gear deployed, watched her face with the focused, continuous attention of a doctor who has decided that this particular face is the most important instrument in the cabin. "Scale of 1 to 10, he said the moment the deceleration eased enough to move safely. 7, she said. Honest, not performing. "Okay, paramedics on board in under 4 minutes. Your only job is to stay still and breathe. Say it back. Breathe." "Good." Carmen was already on the radio, coordinating with the ground crew in the clipped, precise language of medical handoff logistics. Brenda had positioned herself at the forward cabin door, one hand on the release, waiting for the aircraft to come to a full stop. The first-class cabin had gone very still, not the polite, minding-your-own-business stillness of a normal flight, but the electric, conscious stillness of people who are part of something and know it, who have been part of it for the last 2 hours and are watching it arrive at its conclusion. The paramedics boarded within 3 minutes of the door opening, 3 of them, 2 men and a woman moving with the compressed, practiced urgency of people who treat emergencies as routine without ever losing their awareness that they are not. They had a stretcher, a portable kit, the focused calm of emergency medicine, which is different from regular calm, the way a tuning fork is different from ambient sound. It is calibrated, intentional, aimed at something specific. The lead paramedic, his badge read, Torres, went straight to Elliot. They spoke in rapid shorthand the universal language of medical professionals transferring care, and Elliot delivered his in-flight log with the precision and completeness of a written report. Because that was what it was. Because he had been building it in his head since he first crouched beside Naomi's seat, and Torres received it with the focused nodding attention of someone who knows the difference between necessary information and narrative. Torres turned to Naomi. He did not deploy the performed cheerfulness that some emergency workers use with children, the artificially elevated warmth that always lands slightly false. He just said, "Hi," person to person. Straight. "Hi," she said back. "I'm going to take good care of you. My name is Torres. Can I ask you some questions while my team gets set up?" Sure. He asked them age, last, food intake, medication allergies, and she answered with the same directness, the same economy of word, the same clear-eyed engagement that she had brought to everything on this flight. And when Torres said, "You're doing great," she said quietly, "That's what everyone keeps saying." And there was something in her voice that was not bitterness, not quite, but the exhaustion of a person who has been told they are doing great for so long that the phrase has started to feel like a kindness that is also its own kind of pressure. Torres caught it. He was quiet for one beat. Then he said, "You know what? You don't have to do great. You just have to hold on. That's the only requirement right now." And something shifted in Naomi's face, something put down, something released, and she said, "Okay," in a voice that sounded completely different from the "okay" she had been saying all flight. The transfer took 90 seconds. It was not comfortable. She winced twice and made one short involuntary sound, but Torres and his team moved with synchronized precision, and one moment she was in 3B, where she had spent the last 2.5 hours, and the next, she was on the stretcher with a blanket over her and a monitoring clip on her finger. Diane was on her feet immediately, and then stopped. Hands half raised, the particular paralysis of a mother who has been the anchor for so long that suddenly being mobilized feels momentarily like falling. Torres looked at her. "You're her mother. You're coming with us. Stay close. Stay behind the stretcher. Do everything we ask. You'll be in the ambulance with her." And Diane's entire body reorganized itself around those 6 words, and she had her bag from the overhead bin in one motion and was behind the stretcher before Torres finished the sentence. At the door, Diane paused. 1 second, just one, and turned back. Her eyes moved across the faces of the people in the first-class cabin. Carmen, who held her gaze and gave a small, firm nod. Brenda, who pressed one hand briefly to her own chest. Gloria, who had both hands raised in something that was not quite a wave and not quite a prayer, and was perhaps both simultaneously. Darnell, who said nothing because his face said everything that needed to be said. And then Diane's eyes went to Derek Calloway. He was looking at her directly. No performance, no looking away, just looking with the face of a man who has used up his words and is sitting with what remains after them. Brenda stepped forward and handed Carmen a folded printed page. Carmen read it. Her expression changed, a complete and total change, the expression of someone receiving information that recontextualizes everything they have witnessed in the past 2 hours. She looked at Diane. She looked at Derek. And then she said quietly but audibly, the words carrying clearly to row 3, Ms. Diane Carter. "You're the Carter. The Carter Commission." The name landed in the cabin like a depth charge, slow to the surface, and then everything at once. Derek's face went completely still. Not guilty, not yet. Not the way guilt arrives when it has been earned over time and accepted and integrated, but still with the particular quality of a man who has just recognized something he should have recognized much earlier, and is now calculating with terrible speed the full dimension of what that recognition means. The Carter Commission. The federal civil rights watchdog that had brought 3 enforcement actions against major airlines in 4 years. The organization that every aviation attorney in the country knew by name, that Derek knew by name specifically personally because his firm had sat across a deposition table from their lawyers twice. He knew that name. He knew exactly what it meant. He just had not connected it to the woman in the middle seat beside a sick child, with a leather tote and a worn corner and a manila folder with a federal seal inside it. Diane did not acknowledge what Carmen had said. She looked at Derek for exactly 3 seconds, long enough to let him know she saw him seeing her, long enough to let him sit in every dimension of it, and then she turned and stepped through the door, and she was gone. The door closed. The Denver air cut off. The cabin held the absence of them in the specific silence of a room where something important has just left. The cabin held the absence of Diane and Naomi the way a room holds the absence of a sound that has been present so long you only notice it when it stops. Seat 3B was empty, and Carmen had placed the thin airline blanket, the one Diane had drawn from the overhead bin, without being asked. At the beginning of the flight, the one that had covered Naomi's lap for 2.5 hours folded neatly on the empty cushion, and something about the shape of it, the thin fabric folded with that particular care, made it impossible to look at without feeling the weight of everything it represented. The passengers who were going to miss connections would miss connections. The man in 2C had a meeting in Los Angeles that was now impossible. The couple in 1A and 1B had a connecting flight to Maui that had certainly already departed. These were real inconveniences, and nobody in the cabin was pretending otherwise, but the weight of those inconveniences measured against what they had just witnessed sat differently on the scale than it would have at the start of the flight. Things had a different mass now. Darnell leaned back in his seat and stared at the ceiling for a long moment. And then he said, not to anyone in particular, just said it into the air of the cabin, the way you say a thing when you need to give it somewhere to go. I hope that little girl is okay. Nobody responded. Nobody needed to respond. It was the same thing everyone was thinking and saying it out loud. Just let it breathe. Let it exist in the shared space, rather than in the private interior of each person. Gloria had taken a small notepad from her purse and was writing in it with the unhurried deliberateness of someone who knows exactly what she is doing and why. She was writing Naomi's name and the date, and then a sentence, one sentence, the one that had been forming in her chest since the moment she had first looked at that girl leaning against the window with a blanket across her lap. She was going to tell this story. She had decided that. She was going to tell it on a Sunday evening in Baltimore to her grandchildren who had learned to ask her for something real, and she was writing it down now while the details were still sharp, so she would not lose the edges of it when the time came. Carmen moved through the cabin, managing the delayed flight, communicating with the captain, coordinating with ground operations, speaking with passengers about connections and rebooking options with the professional efficiency that the job required. But her movements carried something different from her earlier efficiency, a quality of conscious attention to each thing she did. The quality of someone who has just been reminded at altitude what the job is actually for and is choosing to bring that reminder into every subsequent action rather than setting it aside. Derek had not moved. He had not asked about rebooking, had not flagged anyone down, had not done any of the things he would under ordinary circumstances have done immediately upon landing, the things that men like Derek do instinctively in disrupted situations, the asserting of their right to service, to information, to the management of inconvenience. He sat with the empty seat beside him, and he looked at it, and then he looked at the folded blanket Carmen had placed on it, and then he looked at nothing in particular. Elliot returned to 3D. He glanced at Derek once, the automatic glance of a man becoming aware of something in his peripheral field, and Derek felt it and looked up. Their eyes met. Elliot held the look not hostile, not warm, just even and clear, the look of a man who sees another man and has made no final decision yet about what he sees because he is a doctor, and doctors do not make final decisions before the evidence is in. "Is she going to be okay?" Derek asked. His voice was different from what it had been. Something had been removed from it, the performance, the authority, the practiced confidence of a man who has spent his professional life in rooms where his voice was the most important one. What was left was smaller and quieter and entirely unadorned. Elliot considered the question the way he considered questions from people who were waiting for news about someone they cared about honestly. without the false comfort that helps no one, and the false despair that helps no one either, because neither of those things is what people actually need in those moments. "I don't know," he said. "I'm not going to tell you yes because it's easier. She's in good hands. They have everything they need that I didn't have on this plane." A pause. "She's strong. That I know for certain." Derek nodded. He was quiet for a moment, and then he said, "I didn't know she was that sick." Elliot looked at him. "Would it have changed anything if you had?" The question was not cruel. It was genuine clinical. The kind of question you ask not to wound someone, but because the answer actually matters, because the answer tells you something true about the person sitting across from you. Derek was quiet for a long time, long enough that it became clear he was not avoiding the question, but actually sitting with it, turning it over, examining it from each side with the particular discomfort of a man looking at something he would rather not look at directly. That, Elliot thought, was something. Not enough. But something. The captain's voice returned. They were cleared to continue to Los Angeles 2 hours and 50 minutes from their current position, and the engines built their power again, and Denver fell away behind them, and the sky opened up above and around the aircraft the way it always did on climb out wide and deep and blue, in a way that you only see at altitude clear and cold and very far from the ground. 3 minutes into the climb, Darnell leaned forward in his seat and spoke not to Derek, not addressing anyone specifically, just speaking into the air of the cabin with the calm deliberateness of a man who has decided that something needs to be said and has been waiting until the right moment to say it. Some people spend their whole lives thinking they're the most important person in every room they walk into, and then something happens and they find out they're not, and then they have a choice. They can just keep being who they were, or they can do something about it. He did not look at Derek. He was done. He leaned back. Gloria had stopped writing. She was listening. Elliot, eyes closed, head against the seat, was also listening, despite every appearance of having checked out of the conversation. Derek held his phone in both hands, turned it over, once opened the screen and typed something into the browser. Not impulsively, but with the careful deliberateness of someone who has been thinking about doing this for a while and has decided the moment has arrived. He typed Carter Commission, Aviation, Civil Rights. And then he read what came up, and he kept reading, and his face moved through something private and complicated and entirely internal as he read 6 years of Diane Carter's work documented on the Commission's website, the 3 enforcement actions against major carriers, the settlements, the policy changes that had resulted from each case, the testimony before Congress, the awards, the profile piece in a legal journal from 2 years ago with her photograph, and in the photograph she is wearing exactly the expression she wore in the cabin-controlled precise carrying something beneath it that no formal setting can entirely contain. He read all of it. He put the phone face down on his tray table. He sat with it. Carmen passed through the cabin with a service cart because the service had to continue, because the flight had to continue, because the ordinary mechanics of the world do not pause for even the most significant things that happen inside them. She reached row 3 and stopped. "Can I get you anything?" Elliot said. "Water, please. Thank you." Carmen filled the cup and set it down. She looked at Derek. He looked up from whatever he had been looking at the tray table, his hands, the middle distance, and met her gaze. And something in his expression had changed, had opened slightly in the way a door opens when the person behind it has decided finally to stop holding it closed. "Same," he said. "Just water." And then, after a beat that was only a beat but that contained a full accounting, "Thank you." It was a small thing, monumental in its smallness. Carmen poured the water, placed the cup, moved on. Gloria noted it from 5A and added a single sentence to her notepad. Darnell had his eyes closed, but the locked quality of his face had eased. Not because things were resolved, because things were not resolved and would not be for a long time, but because some things had been said, and the girl was with doctors who had what they needed, and the plane was going west. Elliot opened his eyes and looked at the folded blanket in seat 3B. He thought about Naomi the way he thought about the patients who stayed with him. Not the ones who blurred over time, not from callousness, but from the sheer volume of faces a doctor encounters over 23 years. The way one face overlaps the next, until the individual edges soften, but the ones who arrived so completely themselves, so fully and uncompromisingly present, that they left a shape in you that years didn't touch. Naomi Carter was going to be one of those. He knew it already with the same certainty with which he knew things that were simply true. He thought about the way she had asked whether he was scared. He thought about the way she had said, "I know," instead of "I forgive you," and how those two words were simultaneously kinder and more honest than any of the alternatives, because they acknowledged the truth without releasing anyone from it. He thought about the way she had said, "Don't be mad, Mom," before she asked for anything for herself. He thought about the way she held her chin up, not as a performance, not for anyone else, but because it was simply the only way she knew to be, because her mother had given her that, and she had made it entirely her own. He was going to think about all of it for a long time. Elliot's phone buzzed in his jacket pocket. A Denver area code, a number he didn't recognize, and he answered it before the second buzz had finished with the reflexive speed of a doctor who has learned that phone calls carrying certain kinds of news do not improve with delay. This is Elliot Wade. Dr. Wade. The voice was Diane's, controlled as always, but with a texture beneath the control that he could hear clearly. Now the particular braided quality of exhaustion and relief and fear that was not yet fear because the worst had not happened, but that knew the worst had been close. "This is Diane Carter. Carmen gave me your number. I hope that's all right." "More than all right," he said immediately. "How is she?" A pause. The kind of pause that has weight that tells you something before the words arrive. "She's stable," Diane said. "They've got her on fluids and pain management. They ran imaging." Another pause longer. "They found something." Elliot sat forward. "What did they find? An obstruction, partial in her small intestine. They said it's been building for weeks, possibly longer. That's what's been causing the episodes, the pain, all of it." Elliot closed his eyes for exactly 2 seconds and ran the map partial obstruction. Small intestine treatable, requiring intervention, but not necessarily surgical, manageable with the right equipment and the right team, and the right team was in Denver right now, and the map had clarified into something he could work with, something that was not the worst map by a long measure. Is she going to need surgery? They don't know yet. They're monitoring tonight. If it doesn't resolve with treatment, then yes. But the doctor here, Dr. Reeves, she said that catching it when we did the way we did likely prevented it from becoming a full obstruction. Diane stopped. The sentence didn't need finishing. Both of them understood with complete clarity what a full obstruction at altitude would have meant. "She's going to be okay," Elliot said. Not a question. Not a performance of optimism, but a real and grounded and informed statement from a doctor who had just been given the information he needed to say it and meant every word of it. From Diane's end, a long exhale. The sound of a woman who has been holding something very heavy for a very long time and is being given for the first time permission to set it down. It was a small sound, barely audible, but it carried everything. "Dr. Wade," Diane said, and then she stopped. She tried again. "I don't—" Another stop. "I don't have words for what you did today." "Denise." His voice was gentle but certain. "Your daughter did it." "I handed her water and counted her heartbeats. She did everything else herself." A silence on the Denver end. And then from Diane's side of the phone, "She wants me to tell you something." Elliot waited. "She said the question you asked her whether she was scared. She said the answer was going to be yes. But she changed it because she didn't want you to be scared too. She told me to tell you that. Just now from the hospital bed." Elliot pressed his free hand flat against his knee. He was quiet for a moment. That was the kind of moment that a person carries with them for the rest of their life, not because it was dramatic, but because it was completely true. Then he said, "Tell her that's exactly the right reason." He ended the call. He sat very still for a moment, the phone in his hand. Then he turned to Derek. Derek was already looking at him. His face was completely open. No performance, no armor, no calculation. Nothing constructed, just a man sitting with both hands open on his thighs waiting for something he could not name but desperately needed to hear. "She's stable," Elliot said. "They found what was wrong. She's going to be okay." Derek closed his eyes. 3 seconds, maybe 4. And in those 3 or 4 seconds, something moved across his face that was entirely unguarded, entirely ungoverned. Entirely real relief that had nowhere to hide, the kind that only arrives when you have been sitting with the possibility of the worst and the worst steps back from the door. When he opened his eyes, they were bright. He said nothing. He understood that nothing he could say would not be inadequate. For perhaps the first time on this entire flight, Derek Calloway had arrived at an accurate assessment of his own limitations, and he sat in it without trying to speak past it. From 4. Darnell stirred, his eyes opened with the particular alertness of a man whose body had been listening even while his mind was somewhere else. He looked at Elliot. "News," he said. "She's stable. Going to be okay." Darnell brought both fists together in front of his chest briefly, a gesture that was not a prayer exactly, but lived in the same place prayers live, the space where gratitude exists when it has no other container. "Good," he said. Just that, with an enormous weight behind it. Gloria had turned from the window. Her face was composed, but her eyes were doing something entirely their own. She reached up and touched the closed notepad in her lap with her fingertips gently, the way you touch something that carries meaning, and said, "Thank God." Simple, unadorned, and meant in the most direct possible way, every word of it. Carmen appeared from the galley. She had heard, she could tell from the faces, the shift in the air of the cabin. She stood at the entrance to the first-class section for a moment, and then she did something that was not in any airline manual or training protocol. She pressed one hand over her mouth very briefly and let herself feel it just for a moment, just long enough to be human about it. And then she dropped her hand, straightened her jacket with one precise motion, and walked back to work. Derek reached into the interior pocket of his jacket, the designer jacket that had fit him perfectly when he boarded, and that had been fitting him wrong in some indefinable way for the better part of 3 hours, and took out his wallet. From the wallet, he took a business card, white clean his name and title and firm's address in the restrained, expensive font of a man who has never had to announce himself loudly because the rooms he walks into already know who he is. He held it for a moment, turning it over in his fingers. Then he leaned across the empty seat in 3B, across the folded blanket, across the space where Naomi Carter had spent 2.5 hours, sick and in pain, and more composed than anyone in the cabin had any right to expect, and placed the card on Carmen's service tray as she passed. Carmen looked at it, then at him. "Whatever legal process comes from today," Derek said, "I'm not going to fight it. I want that on record. Whatever Diane Carter and her daughter decide to do, I'm not going to contest it." He paused. "And if there's a way to send something to the hospital, she's in Flowers, whatever is appropriate, I want to do that through you. Through the airline, whatever the right way is." Carmen looked at the card. Then at him again, with the full, careful, professional attention of a woman who has been watching this man for 3 hours and is making a final, honest assessment of what she sees. "I'm not trying to buy anything," Derek said before she could respond, and the words came out without their usual polish, raw, unmediated, the words of a man speaking faster than his performance instincts could dress the thought. "I know how it looks. I'm not. I just want her to know that someone on that flight was thinking about her afterward." Even, he stopped. Even the wrong person. Carmen looked at him for a long moment. And then something shifted behind her eyes. Not forgiveness, not absolution, not anything that clean or simple, but the expression of a woman looking at another human being and making an honest accounting of what is actually there, which is more complicated than forgiveness and more useful. "I'll pass it along," she said. She picked up the card and moved on. Elliot had watched the exchange without speaking. After Carmen was gone, he said, "What you just did doesn't undo what happened." "I know that," Derek said immediately. "It also doesn't mean nothing," Elliot said. Derek looked at him. "Both things can be true at the same time. That's usually how it works." He held Derek's gaze steadily the way you hold something that needs to be held without softening it. "That's usually exactly how it works." Derek absorbed this. Then he nodded slowly with the nod of a man who has been given something he did not know he needed. Something that gave him no comfort, but gave him something more useful than comfort. A frame for the thing he was carrying, a way to understand it that did not require him to be entirely beyond help, or entirely forgiven, that located him somewhere in the honest, difficult middle where actual change becomes possible. 15 minutes to Los Angeles. The city materialized below them, the endless horizontal grid of it, the particular light of Southern California in the afternoon, the mountains behind, and the ocean somewhere ahead, the enormous ordinary fact of it coming up to meet them. The landing prep moved through the cabin, Carmen's voice over the PA warm and professional, and then in a register just slightly different from the professional one, just enough different that everyone who was paying attention would notice it, and everyone was paying attention. "We hope those of you who need to know everyone is going to be okay." Darnell started to clap. One single clap, slow and deliberate, not celebratory, not the clap of a crowd at a performance, but the kind of clap that is not about sound at all, that is about witness, about acknowledging something that deserves to be acknowledged. Gloria joined it, then the couple in 1A, then the man in 5C who had spent most of the flight with his headphones in. Then others spreading backward through the aircraft, the way things spread in enclosed spaces, fast and complete and total. Carmen stood at the front of the cabin. She did not cry. She was too professional to cry, and she had decided that long ago. But she pressed her lips together, and she held the faces looking at her, all of them, and she let what they were giving her land. And then she nodded once deeply, the nod of someone who understands exactly what is being acknowledged and is receiving it with full attention. Derek did not clap. He sat with his hands in his lap, and he listened to the sound of people who had been through something together arriving on the other side of it, and he did not pretend to be part of that, because he knew what his part had been, and he was not going to falsify it now. But he did not look away either. He did not close himself off from the sound of it or the meaning of it. He sat in it and let it land on him the way it needed to land, all of it, the full weight of it. And somewhere underneath the jacket and the title and everything he had constructed around himself over 46 years, he knew it was not enough, and he knew it was a beginning, and he understood for perhaps the first time in his life that beginnings are supposed to feel insufficient. That's what makes them beginnings. The wheels touched. Los Angeles. The gate appeared. The jet bridge connected. One by one, the passengers collected themselves and moved toward the door, the ordinary flow of arrival carrying them forward. And Derek Calloway was the last to stand and the last to go, and he walked down the jet bridge, carrying everything the day had put in him, every piece of himself he had not looked at directly before today, into the fluorescent ordinary of the terminal and everything that came next. 2 days after the flight, Carmen's incident report landed in the airline's legal department at 9:14 in the morning, formatted with the precision of someone who had been building it since the moment Derek's foot connected with Naomi's leg and had not stopped building it until it was complete. Every word, every exchange, every request to relocate a 14-year-old girl in medical distress, time-stamped, cross-referenced, corroborated by written statements from 5 passengers who had witnessed the events and had been waiting, some of them, to be asked. Gloria's statement was the longest. Darnell's was the most precise. Elliott's was the one that carried the weight of a physician's testimony. At 11:47 the same morning, a second document arrived at the airline's legal department from an external source, a formal notice of investigation from the Carter Commission on Civil Rights in Transportation, signed by Diane Carter, director, and referencing the incident on Flight 1142 as the subject of a civil rights inquiry under federal statute. The notice arrived not through standard postal channels, but through the Commission's direct federal communications line, which meant it bypassed the usual administrative processing and went straight to the General Counsel's desk, where it sat for approximately 4 minutes before the General Counsel called the managing partner at the airline's outside legal firm. That call lasted 8 minutes. At the end of it, the managing partner at the firm called Derek Calloway. The irony was total and architectural. Derek's firm, the firm where he was a senior partner whose name appeared on letterhead that had represented this airline in 2 of the previous 3 Carter Commission enforcement actions, was now being asked to defend the airline against a complaint generated entirely by Derek's own conduct on one of that airline's flights. The conflict of interest was not ambiguous, not arguable, not something that could be managed with a carefully worded memo. It was complete. Derek could not be involved in the defense. Derek arguably was the defense's central problem. The call between the managing partner and Derek lasted 11 minutes. Derek did not speak for most of it. The airline's leadership understood without needing anyone to explain it what a Carter Commission investigation meant in practical terms. The 3 previous commission actions had resulted in combined settlements exceeding $40 million and mandatory structural overhauls of training and complaint handling procedures at each carrier involved. The airline was not going to fight this one. Within 72 hours of receiving the commission's notice, they contacted Diane Carter's office directly to express their intention to cooperate fully with the investigation and to begin the process of voluntary disclosure. Carmen's incident report, all 14 pages of it, became public within 48 hours of the investigation's announcement because the Commission's operating procedures required it, and because Carmen had known when she was writing it that it would and had written accordingly. The video footage from 3 passenger phones, each capturing different angles of the same events, corroborated every detail of the report with a completeness that left nothing to interpretation. The footage circulated across every major news outlet within hours of the report's release. Derek's name was in every headline. His firm placed him on indefinite administrative leave the following morning. The press release used the word reviewing 4 times, with the particular careful repetition of institutional language that is designed to create the impression of due diligence while saying as little as possible about the conclusion that has already been reached. It did not use the word misconduct. The people who read press releases in Derek's world did not need to be told what the absence of a denial meant. His name disappeared from the firm's website within 6 weeks of the incident, removed quietly, and without announcement, the digital equivalent of a nameplate being taken off a door in the middle of the night. In the first week after the footage circulated, the airline received over 12,000 written communications from passengers and advocacy organizations. Of these, 11,243 expressed some form of condemnation of what had occurred. The remaining 757 were also condemnations. The arithmetic was not complicated. The State Bar Association opened a formal ethics review of Derek Calloway within 30 days of the incident. These reviews move slowly by institutional design, by the deliberate caution of a body that understands the weight of the decisions it makes. The review would take 14 months. Derek spent those 14 months in the particular suspended state of a man who has not yet faced the full accounting, but can see it approaching, can see the shape of it in the distance, clear and unhurried and inevitable, and for whom the waiting has its own specific texture that is different from punishment, but is not the absence of it. The Carter Commission filed its formal complaint against the airline 60 days after the investigation opened. The complaint ran to 87 pages. It named Derek Calloway directly. It also named the 17 previous complaints of similar conduct documented in the airline's own internal records complaints that had been marked, resolved with no documentation of resolution that had been filed away in a system that was not designed to find patterns, because finding patterns would require acting on them, and acting on them would cost money and time and attention that the people running the system had decided they did not have. The Commission's investigators had spent 60 days doing what the airline had spent 4 years not doing, reading the complaints in sequence, laying them side by side, and seeing what was there. Naomi did not need surgery. The partial obstruction resolved over 3 days of treatment fluids, carefully managed medication, the attentive monitoring of Dr. Reeves and her team at Children's Hospital Colorado, who had seen this before and knew how to give the body the conditions it needed to do what it was trying to do. By Thursday morning, Naomi ate half a bowl of oatmeal slowly without pain. She looked at her mother when she finished. She didn't say anything. Neither did Diane. Some things are complete without words. The specialist appointment they had been unable to keep in Los Angeles had been the thing that weighed on Naomi most heavily during those 3 days. Not the pain, not the treatment, not the hospital itself, but the idea of her mother calling again, waiting again, navigating the long, frustrated process of rescheduling an appointment that had taken 4 months to obtain in the first place. She had not said this to Diane. She had learned not to say certain things to Diane, not because Diane couldn't bear them, but because Diane would fold them into her own weight and carry them without complaint, and Naomi had seen clearly enough what her mother was already carrying. What Naomi did not know, lying in the hospital bed on Tuesday morning, watching Denver light come through the window, was that Elliot Wade had already made a phone call. His colleague, David Park, pediatric gastroenterologist, trained at Johns Hopkins, currently practicing at Cedars-Sinai in Los Angeles, one of the best doctors in his specialty that Elliot knew personally and trusted completely, had received a message from Elliot the afternoon of the flight sent from 30,000 feet between a patient consult and the landing in Denver, long story. Young patient 14, partial small intestine obstruction, currently at Children's Hospital Colorado. Mother was trying to get to you. Had an appointment at your office. They had to divert. Her name is Naomi Carter. Please call me when you land. Park had called within the hour. He had contacted Children's Hospital Colorado the following morning. By Tuesday afternoon, he was in direct communication with Dr. Reeves and had formally assumed Naomi's ongoing care. Diane learned about it when Park called her directly at the hospital and introduced himself. She stood by the window for a long moment after the call, holding the phone against her chest, and did not say anything. And then she went back to her daughter's bedside and sat down and took Naomi's hand. The same way she had been taking it for 3 days, with the same grip, the same warmth, the same uninterrupted presence. The leather tote sat in the chair by the window, the manila folder visible through the partially open zipper, Carter Commission on Civil Rights in Transportation. Case File 4, and on the bed beside Naomi, a printed copy of the Commission's formal complaint against the airline, which Diane had reviewed twice that morning with the focused attention of a professional, reading her own work, checking it with the same rigor she applied to everything. This flight had not been random. Diane Carter traveled constantly for the Commission's work depositions hearings, site reviews, meetings with legal teams in cities across the country, and she documented every flight, every interaction with the quiet, methodical attention of someone who understands that the record is the work, that what goes undocumented remains deniable, that the difference between a complaint and a case is evidence. Naomi had been with her because the Los Angeles trip was both the specialist appointment for Naomi in the morning, a deposition in the afternoon. They shared a city and a day, and so they shared the flight, and so they shared row 3, and so they shared what happened in it. On Wednesday afternoon, an envelope arrived at the hospital addressed to Naomi Carter in careful handwriting on a heavy cream envelope. It was from Gloria, full name Gloria Watkins, retired schoolteacher Baltimore, who had obtained the hospital's mailing address through Carmen, who had passed it along without being asked, because she had seen the expression on Gloria's face in 5A, and had understood instinctively what it meant. The letter was 2 pages handwritten in the same deliberate hand as the envelope. It told Naomi what Gloria had seen, not the incident, not the events, not the things everyone already knew, but what she had seen in Naomi, specifically the qualities she had recognized, and the reasons they mattered, and the particular kind of person Gloria believed Naomi was going to become. Naomi read it twice. She folded it along its original creases and held it for a moment, and then she looked at her mother and said, "Can you keep this with the case file?" And Diane opened the leather tote and placed the letter carefully inside the manila folder where it would remain for the next 14 months, traveling with Diane to depositions and hearings and congressional offices, kept in the same place as the evidence. The Carter Commission's investigation took 60 days from the formal filing to the release of findings, which was fast by the standards of federal civil rights work, but which felt to everyone involved like an appropriate pace for the weight of what was being examined. The report ran 94 pages. The executive summary was 3 paragraphs. It landed in the aviation industry like a stone dropped from a great height into still water. The impact point sharp and immediate, the circles spreading outward through every layer of the industry and not stopping. The findings were specific, and they were documented, and they were in the language of the Commission's reports, well supported by evidence, which is the language of people who have learned to say things in ways that cannot be argued with, because the argument against them would require arguing with facts rather than with framing. The Commission found that the airline had received 17 complaints of conduct substantially similar to Derek Calloway's over the preceding 4 years. Of these, 12 had been marked resolved in the airline's internal system with no documentation of how they had been resolved or what outcome had been reached. The remaining 5 had been forwarded to legal review and then quietly closed with no action within 90 days of filing. The pattern was not subtle. It had been there documented in the airline's own records, waiting for someone to read it in sequence rather than in isolation. The Commission had read it in sequence. The settlement reached without litigation because the airline had decided early that fighting was not a viable position, required mandatory bias awareness training for all customer-facing staff, developed in partnership with an independent civil rights organization rather than by the airline's own HR department. It established an independent ombudsman for discrimination complaints, reporting not to the airline's legal team but to a board that included Commission representatives. It imposed financial penalties of $8.2 million, a portion of which was directed by the settlement terms to a fund supporting medical transportation assistance for families with chronic illness. And it created as a named specific requirement a new passenger protocol. Any passenger in a commercial airline's premium cabin who was asked or pressured to relocate to a different seat by crew or fellow passengers was entitled in writing to be informed of their right to refuse and to have the matter escalated to the captain. Inside the Commission's offices in Washington, this protocol was referred to in working documents by its internal name, the Naomi Protocol. Diane had not chosen the name publicly. She had written it into a working document on the morning she drafted the settlement terms, sitting at her desk with the leather tote on the floor beside her chair, and it had stayed there, used by the staff, used in internal memos, never announced. Naomi would learn about it months later, sitting at the kitchen table reading the case file that Diane had left there because Diane left case files on the kitchen table the way some parents left work paperwork, because her work was her work and her home was her home, and she had never drawn the line between them with a sharp instrument. For Derek Calloway, the consequences arrived slowly and completely, the way water arrives in a room where the seals have failed. Not all at once, not with the drama of a sudden break, but continuously thoroughly until everything is reached. The firm's withdrawal from the airline's representation cost them 2 additional aviation clients within a month. Clients who drew the obvious conclusion about the firm's judgment in having a partner of Derek's particular profile handling aviation civil rights defense work. His name came off the website. He resigned rather than wait for the conclusion of the Bar Association's review, which made the review perfunctory but did not end it because ethics reviews do not conclude simply because the subject has removed himself from the situation the review was examining. His license was suspended for 18 months with reinstatement conditional on completion of a bias awareness program and supervised practice. He sold the apartment. He moved to a smaller city. He is not relevant to what came next, which is not about him. Darnell back in Queens read the commission's settlement announcement on his phone at a job site during a lunch break eating a sandwich sitting on the hood of a truck in the October sun. He read it through twice, and then he called his daughter, 19 years old, studying communications in Maryland, perpetually, lovingly irritated with him about something, and said, "I need you to look something up. The Carter Commission. Look up what they just did." She looked it up while he was on the phone, and she said, "Dad, who is this woman?" And he said, "Somebody's mom." The text from David Park arrived on a Tuesday morning in November, 6 weeks after the flight, while Elliot was moving between a patient consult and a staff meeting in the ongoing rushing current of a hospital day that was in every respect completely ordinary. He was in a corridor under fluorescent lights, carrying a paper cup of coffee that had gone cold, and his phone buzzed in his coat pocket, and he pulled it out without slowing down. Naomi Carter. Partial obstruction fully resolved, no surgery needed. Responding well, going home Thursday. And then a second message, a minute later. "She wanted me to tell the doctor on the plane something. She says, 'You were right. Counting down works.'" Elliot stopped walking. He was in the middle of a hospital corridor between a consult and a meeting in the full rushing ordinary current of a life that had been continuing exactly as it always continued. Appointments, rounds, paperwork, the continuous and necessary and completely relentless work of a practicing physician. And he stopped and he read it twice, and then he stood still for a moment in the fluorescent corridor with his cold coffee and the sounds of the hospital all around him. And he felt something in his chest that was the real kind of thing, the kind that starts there and travels up unhurried and arrives in your face fully formed, and he let it. Then he typed back, "Tell her I'm going to use that from now on." He put the phone in his pocket. He walked down the corridor. He thought about Naomi Carter with the specific quality of thought he reserved for the patients who stayed with him, not the ones who blurred, not from callousness, but from the sheer volume of faces that a doctor accumulates over a career, but the ones who arrived so fully themselves that they left a shape behind. He thought about her question, "Are you scared?" and the information that she had changed her answer to protect him. That a 14-year-old in a medical crisis managing an acute episode at altitude had looked at a doctor she had known for 20 minutes and decided that his fear was a thing she could do something about. The generosity of that. The profound and entirely natural generosity of it, unremarked by her simply offered. He thought about Diane, about what it meant to move through the world with that particular quality of stillness that is not passivity, but its precise opposite. That is the compressed, controlled, continuously maintained force of a person who has chosen to respond to a world that keeps requiring more of her than it should, with absolute consistency, absolute documentation, absolute refusal to be deniable. 6 years of that. A leather tote on every flight, a manila folder with a federal seal, a daughter sitting beside her, learning the same thing, learning to hold her chin up not because someone told her to perform it for anyone else, but because it was the right way to move through a world that was going to keep requiring it, and because her mother had shown her that the requiring of it was not the end of anything. It was the beginning. He reached the door of the staff meeting room. He paused one beat, just one, and then he pushed it open and went in. The federal hearing room in Washington was the kind of room that carries the weight of its own function. High ceilings, the particular quality of light that comes through institutional windows, rows of seats filling with the careful, purposeful attention of people who have come to witness something they understand to be significant. The Congressional Subcommittee on Civil Aviation had convened to receive the Carter Commission's findings, and the Commission's director was testifying, and the room was full in the way that rooms are full when something true is about to be said in a place designed for the saying of true things. Naomi Carter was 15 now. She sat in the gallery on the left side, 3 rows back from the front, in a navy blazer she had bought for the occasion, and that she had already decided she would not wear again because it was too formal for her actual life, which was a thought she had had at some point during the train ride from Baltimore, where she and Diane had stayed the night before. She sat with her back straight and her hands folded in her lap and her eyes on her mother, who was at the microphone at the front of the room. And what Naomi felt in her chest watching, that was not something she had a precise word for. It was not pride exactly, though pride was part of it, and it was not relief, though. Relief was part of it too, and it was not happiness, because the situation being addressed was not a happy situation. It was a situation that had happened to people, including to herself. And that was in the process of being named and faced and changed. It was something more like recognition, like seeing something that had always been true, finally standing in a light where everyone could see it. Diane's voice from the front of the room was the same voice it had been at 37,000 feet and in the hospital in Denver, and in 14 months of depositions and hearings and meetings, and the quiet, continuous work of documenting what needed to be documented. Controlled, precise, carrying something beneath it that no formal setting could fully contain, and she was speaking about what the Commission had found, not just in the case that had begun on Flight 142, but in the pattern of cases that the Commission's investigation had revealed, the 17 complaints that had gone unaddressed, the infrastructure of avoidance that had made unaddressed complaints the default outcome rather than the exception. She did not call it a systemic problem. She called it a habit, an institution-wide habit of choosing comfort over accountability, of filing complaints in systems that were designed not to surface them, of marking things resolved when they had simply been set aside. The distinction between systemic and habitual, she said, mattered because calling something a habit named it as a choice, something made by people, something that could be unmade by people, rather than a force of nature that simply existed and could not be changed. The room was very quiet, in the way that rooms get quiet when something is being said that changes the shape of the air. In the gallery, 3 rows behind Naomi Gloria Watkins sat with her reading glasses on a beaded chain around her neck and her hands folded in her lap and her eyes on Diane Carter, with the expression of a woman who has been waiting a long time to see something, and is now seeing it, and is not going to look away from it for even a moment. She had not told anyone she was coming. She had read about the hearing in the paper and bought a train ticket and come, because she had been at the beginning of this and she wanted to be here at a significant point along the road. It had become not for any reason she could have articulated clearly, just because it seemed right, because some stories deserve witnesses at more than one moment. In his office in New York, Elliot watched the hearing on a live stream on his laptop with the door closed between a morning consult and an afternoon round eating a sandwich he kept forgetting to eat because he kept watching the screen instead. He watched Diane Carter speak with the focused attention of a man watching someone he spent 2 hours with at 37,000 feet standing in front of Congress, doing what she had been doing before the flight, and what she would continue doing after it, just now more visibly, with more people watching, with the weight of a federal settlement, and 94 pages of findings behind every word. He thought about the way she had said she's stable on the phone from Denver, and the exhale that had come after it, that single long, barely audible exhale that had carried everything. He finished his sandwich. He closed the laptop and went back to work. Carmen was not in the hearing room. She was on a different route, doing the work that continued regardless of what was happening in rooms where her incident report was being cited as foundational evidence. She would watch the recording that evening in a hotel room in Phoenix, alone with the volume low because the walls were thin. She would watch it twice. The second time through, she would not pause when she heard her own name, the flight attendant whose documentation made this case possible, whose report provided the evidence on which every subsequent finding rests. And she would sit with that for a while in the thin-walled hotel room and think about what the job was actually for, and why she had chosen it, and whether what she had done on that flight was exceptional, or whether it was simply the job done exactly right, and decide that the answer was probably both, and that both was enough. Naomi walks out of the federal building into the late afternoon sun, with Diane beside her and the leather tote over Diane's shoulder. The same tote, the same worn corner. And she tilts her face up toward the sky, not performing anything for anyone, not marking the moment for any audience. Just a girl, 15 years old, standing in November, light in Washington, D.C., and the light is on her face, and the city is all around her, and her mother is beside her, and she does not say anything because she does not need to, because her mother said it 1,000 times before any of this began. Said it in hospital waiting rooms and examination corridors and on a plane at 37,000 feet, when the world was doing what it sometimes does, and Naomi has held it. She has held her chin up through every single moment of it. Not because anyone was watching, not because she was performing strength for anyone, but because her mother gave her that, and she made it her own. And it is the only way she knows to be, and it is enough, and it will always be enough. In a law office 3 blocks from the federal building, in a room with a conference table and a pitcher of water, and 4 members of the State Bar Association's ethics panel arranged on one side of it. Derek Calloway sits across from the people who have spent 14 months reading the documentation of what he did and who he was before. One afternoon at altitude changed the direction of his reckoning, and on the table between them are Carmen's incident report and a child's medical file and the commission's settlement terms with his name on page 7, and a photograph. A thin airline blanket folded neatly on an empty seat in the particular careful way of someone who cared about the person who had occupied it, and this photograph has become in the year since Flight 1142. The image most associated with the Carter Commission's 4th enforcement action, printed in legal journals and civil rights advocacy publications and reprinted on the Commission's website. A thin piece of fabric carrying the shape of someone who should never have had to fight for the seat it covered. And Derek looks at it as he has been looking at it since he came into this room, and he lets it be what it is. 6 weeks after the hearing, an envelope arrives at Naomi's school postmarked Denver from Children's Hospital, Colorado. And inside it is a card signed by Torres and his team. All of them their names in different handwriting around the margins of the card. The signatures of people who remember a specific Tuesday in October, because of how it went, and they have named a new patient comfort protocol in the pediatric wing after her, not because of what happened to her on that flight, but because of how she handled it, because a 14-year-old in a medical crisis changed her answer to a doctor's question to protect him from being afraid, and because that kind of grace, the kind that reaches outward, even when everything is reaching inward, the kind that gives, even when there is not much left, deserves a name, and the name they have given it is hers. Months have passed. The particular quality of time that follows the resolution of something important, not the dramatic rush of events, but the slower, steadier time of a life returning to its shape, a life that is the same shape it was, but is held differently now, carried with a different awareness of what it contains. Naomi sits at the desk in her room doing homework. Differential equations. The same kind she was doing in the weeks before Denver, the numbers steady on the page, her pencil moving with the easy confidence of someone who has always understood that mathematics is a language that does not change based on who is speaking it, a language that is the same on Tuesday in a hospital bed as it is on a Monday at a desk at home. She is 15. She has had appointments since Denver has had hard days, has had the particular ongoing relationship with her own body that becomes eventually simply part of the texture of your life. Not the whole of it, not the defining fact, just something that is there, that you learn to carry without letting it be the only thing you carry. On the desk beside her homework, 3 things arranged without intent. the natural accumulation of objects that matter. Gloria's letter, folded along its original creases, kept. The card from Torres's team propped against her pencil holder, so the names in the margins are visible, the different handwriting of people who remembered, and a single printed page from the Commission's website. The settlement terms the paragraph that contains the words Naomi Protocol in the formal language of a federal civil rights document. A paragraph she found herself 3 months after Denver, sitting at the kitchen table reading the case file her mother had left there, reading it with the focused attention of a girl who had learned from her mother that the record is the work, that what goes unread remains unknown, that understanding a thing completely is the first step toward everything else. She had not asked Diane about it. She had simply read it and folded the page and added it to what she was keeping. She picks up her pencil. She goes back to her homework. The numbers are where she left them, patient and certain, waiting for her to return. Outside the window, an airplane crosses the sky commercial, catching the last November light on its wings, moving west toward somewhere, carrying people who have somewhere to be. She watches it for a moment. Then she looks back down. She holds her chin up. Not for anyone. Not because anyone told her to. Because her mother gave her that, and she made it her own. And it is the only way she knows to be. If this story stayed with you, if Naomi's courage moved you, if Diane's strength reminded you of someone you know, if you believe that every child deserves to be treated with dignity regardless of who they are or what they look like, please subscribe to our channel, hit the notification bell, and share this video with someone who needs to hear it. Stories like this one matter because the people in them matter. And the work of telling them, the work of making sure they are heard, that work continues. Drop a comment and tell me what city you're watching from. I want to see how far this story has traveled.